The soft hum of overhead lights mixed with the distant chatter of shoppers as Daniel Royce moved through the bustling city mall. It was a routine Saturday afternoon, and the air carried the familiar scents of roasted coffee, department store cologne, and freshly made pretzels from the food court. He had no particular destination in mind, no urgent tasks to complete. It was one of those rare weekends where time felt slower, where he could drift through the crowd unnoticed, soaking in the world without obligation. Daniel had spent the morning, meeting with a few business associates over lunch, discussing the usual market trends, industry shifts, half-hearted banter about the chaos of the world. By the time they had parted ways, he felt the pull of solitude, the quiet craving to exist without conversation for a while. The mall, despite its energy, had always given him that odd comfort. Among strangers, no one expected anything from him. He moved past a group of teenagers laughing near a pop-up kiosk, their voices carrying over the polished tile floors. A child tugged impatiently at his mother's sleeve near the entrance of a toy store, eyes wide with anticipation. A couple walked hand in hand, lost in quiet conversation. Life in all its small moments unfolded around him. Then, as he stepped onto the main concourse near the entrance of an upscale clothing store, he saw her. Anisha Rosnah. She was standing by a display of neatly folded jackets, one hand resting lightly on the fabric, her gaze distant. Daniel had never met her personally, but her face was familiar. She was one of those political analysts who had become a lightning rod for controversy, admired by many, hated by just as many, sharp, unfiltered, unwavering in her stance. He had watched her from a distance, through televised debates, through the endless cycle of online discourse. Though he did not always agree with her, he respected her ability to hold her ground. She seemed unaware of the eyes that followed her, or perhaps she was simply used to it. Then came the shift. It started subtly, a woman stepping into Daniel's peripheral vision, her posture stiff, her movements charged with an energy that felt unnatural in the otherwise relaxed setting. She was in her late 40s with sharp features and an expression carved from something colder than anger. There was an intensity in her eyes, a quiet storm brewing beneath the surface. Daniel slowed his steps, something instinctual telling him to observe before moving on. The woman stopped a few feet from Anisha, hovering in that uncomfortable space, between personal boundaries and deliberate intrusion. There was no hesitation in her stance, no uncertainty. She had come here for a reason. Anisha must have sensed the presence behind her because she turned, her expression neutral at first, then shifting slightly as her gaze met the woman's. A brief flicker of recognition passed through her features, not of the woman herself, but of the situation. She had seen this before. She had lived this before. Then the woman spoke. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the casual murmur of the mall with an edge that demanded attention. The words were low at first, just enough for Anisha to hear, but the intent was clear. She was not here for a polite exchange. Daniel couldn't make out the exact words from where he stood, but he could read the body language. The woman's lips moved quickly, her tone rising with each sentence, the controlled cadence of someone who had been rehearsing this moment in her head. Anisha remained still, her face betraying nothing but quiet calculation. A few heads turned, drawn by the tension in the air. People who had been focused on their shopping moments ago now hesitated in their steps, sensing something unfolding that didn't quite belong in a place like this. And then, the woman's voice broke through. People like you. The words came like a blade slicing through the space between them. A phrase that held weight, that carried centuries of anger and division in its simplicity. The air thickened. A moment stretched too long, charged with an energy that could shift in any direction. Anisha's, shoulders squared, but her voice remained calm when she finally responded. She was just shopping, she told the woman, that was all. The woman's laughter was sharp, humorless. Shopping, she repeated, as if the very notion was ridiculous. No, she wasn't here to shop. She was here to shove her propaganda down everyone's throat, to spread lies, to poison minds. That was what she did, wasn't it? That was who she was. Daniel felt the shift in his own body now, the way unease crept up his spine. He had no personal stake in this, yet something about the way the woman spoke, the way she closed in on Anisha, made it impossible to simply walk away. A few feet away, a mother pulled her child closer, guiding him toward another aisle. A young couple exchanged glances before stepping aside. No one intervened. Not yet. Then came the shove. It wasn't violent, not enough to knock Anisha down, but enough to force her a step backward, enough for the movement to send a ripple through the space, a silent gasp that traveled through the onlookers. Anisha didn't react immediately. She didn't stagger, didn't push back. Instead, she stood firm, her jaw tightening, her eyes locking onto the woman's with something unreadable. And that was when Daniel moved. His legs carried him forward before his mind could fully register the decision. By the time he stepped between them, the woman had already started speaking again, her voice sharp, her hands gesturing with frustration. But the second he entered her line of sight, she faltered, her expression shifting from anger to irritation. She demanded to know who he was, why he was interfering. Daniel kept his voice steady, his stance unyielding. That was enough, he told. Her. She needed to stop. The woman's eyes narrowed, scanning him for weakness, for something to latch onto. She found nothing. For a brief second, no one spoke. The mall was still moving around them, but this moment, this collision of temperaments, of beliefs, of simmering tensions, stood frozen in time. Then came the response, slow, deliberate. So, now you're the morality police? Daniel exhaled, keeping his frustration contained. This wasn't about politics, he told her. This wasn't about who was right or wrong in some grand ideological debate. This was about basic decency, about knowing when to step back, when to recognize a line had been crossed. The woman scoffed, but her stance wavered just slightly, as if a part of her knew she had lost control of the moment. The weight of the eyes. Around them, the quiet judgment of strangers pressed against her like an unseen force. Then, a new presence entered the scene. Two men in dark uniforms, the unmistakable authority of mall security. One of them, taller than the other with a no-nonsense expression, stepped forward and surveyed the situation. His gaze landed on Anisha first, then Daniel, then finally the woman. His voice was firm, neutral, but the question was clear. Was there a problem here? The woman was quick to speak, her words laced with indignation. Yes, she insisted. There was a problem. Anisha remained silent. Daniel held his ground. The next decision would not be theirs to make. The moment stretched in tense silence as the security officers took in the scene, their sharp eyes scanning the body language of those involved. The taller officer, a broad-shouldered man with a buzz cut and an air of quiet authority, stepped forward first, his presence alone demanding compliance. His partner, leaner but equally alert, stayed a step behind, watching the small crowd that had formed around the altercation. The woman wasted no time in twisting the situation to her advantage. She pointed a rigid finger toward Anisha, her voice laced with righteous indignation, claiming that she had simply been expressing her concerns and had been unfairly confronted. Her words spilled out quickly, desperate to frame herself as the victim before anyone else could speak. She gestured toward Daniel, accusing him of intimidation, of inserting himself into something that had nothing to do with him. Daniel remained, still, his face unreadable, his heartbeat steady despite the quiet frustration building beneath his calm exterior. He had seen this before, the way people like her bent reality to fit their own narratives, the way they grasped at whatever they could to avoid accountability. He had no patience for it, but patience was not what was required of him right now. Anisha, however, remained silent. She had not spoken since the initial shove, her face composed, her posture straight. She did not defend herself, did not argue, did not attempt to engage. There was a quiet defiance in the way she carried herself, a refusal to give the situation any more fuel than it had already taken. The taller officer glanced at her before turning his attention to Daniel, his expression expectant. He was waiting for a second account, for confirmation or contradiction. Daniel met his gaze evenly. He stated the facts, laying them out in an even tone. The woman had approached Anisha unprovoked. She had instigated the exchange, raised her voice, and then escalated it into physical contact. Anisha had done nothing to warrant the aggression. He had stepped in only when it became clear that the situation was spiraling into something worse. The officer listened without interruption, nodding slightly as he processed the information. He turned his attention back to the woman, whose face had twisted into barely contained outrage. She crossed her arms, shifting her weight from foot to foot, as if the action itself could shake off the pressure of the moment. She demanded to know why she was being treated like the aggressor, insisting that she had simply been standing her ground against the so-called lies that people like Anisha spread. Her voice wavered slightly, though, betraying the creeping realization that this was not playing out the way she had anticipated. The second officer, the leaner one who had been watching the surrounding crowd, finally spoke for the first time. He pointed toward the onlookers, asking if anyone else had witnessed what had happened. A few hesitant glances were exchanged among the bystanders. Most people had come to watch, but few were willing to involve themselves further. Then, a man, near the edge of the crowd, middle-aged with graying hair and a shopping bag hanging from one wrist, took a small step forward. He had seen everything, he explained. The woman had started the confrontation. She had been the one to escalate. He confirmed Daniel's account. Then another voice. A younger man, someone who had been recording on his phone. He had footage, he said. He had captured the moment the woman had shoved Anisha. The shift in the air was immediate. The woman's face drained of color for just a fraction of a second before she recovered, grasping for any remaining leverage. She insisted that it had not been a shove, just a reflexive movement, a reaction to the frustration she had been feeling. She blamed the media, the political climate, the so-called divisiveness that people like Anisha encouraged. But the words felt weaker now, less certain. The tide was no longer in her favor. The taller officer finally made his decision. His voice was firm but not unkind. He informed the woman that she needed to step away, that she would not be allowed to continue, causing a disturbance. If she refused, further action would be taken. For a moment, it looked as if she might push back further, might make one last desperate attempt to assert control. But then her shoulders stiffened, her lips pressed into a thin line, and she let out a sharp breath. She muttered something under her breath, something no one quite caught, and then turned on her heel, storming off in the direction of the nearest exit. The crowd slowly began to dissipate. The younger man with the footage hesitated for a moment before slipping his phone back into his pocket, walking away with the others. The tension in the air lingered, but the moment itself had passed. Daniel exhaled, glancing toward Anisha. She was watching the woman's retreating figure, her expression unreadable. Then, as if sensing his gaze, she finally looked at him. There was no gratitude in her eyes, but neither was there resentment, just acknowledgement, just the quiet understanding of two people who had, for a brief moment, been caught in the same storm. Daniel gave a small nod. Anisha held his gaze for a beat longer before turning away, reaching for a jacket from the display as if nothing had happened at all. The officers lingered for a moment longer before moving on. Daniel stood there for a few seconds more, then finally turned and walked away. He did not look back, but somehow he knew this was not the end. Daniel had barely made it home before the notifications started flooding his phone. At first, they came in sporadically, random alerts from social media, news updates, messages from people he hadn't spoken to in years. He dismissed them without much thought, tossing his keys onto the counter and shrugging off his jacket. The confrontation at the mall had left a strange weight in his chest, but he had assumed the moment would fade just as quickly as it had escalated. He had done what any decent person would have done. That was all. Then the vibrations of his phone became relentless, the screen lighting up with calls, messages, and links being sent to him from multiple contacts. He frowned as he picked it up, unlocking the screen. The first thing he saw was his own face staring back at him from a grainy video thumbnail. His breath slowed. Someone had filmed everything. He tapped on the link without thinking, and the video began playing. The The camera was shaky, taken from a distance, but it captured the entire scene. The woman approaching Anisha, the confrontation, the shove, and then his own intervention. The voices were clear, the tension unmistakable. The caption beneath the video was blunt, inflammatory. Man. Defends Anisha Rosnah from public harassment. Hero or political pawn? Daniel's stomach tightened. This was bigger than he had expected. His name was suddenly all over the internet. The video had gone viral, spreading across platforms within hours. People had begun dissecting the footage, arguing over what had really happened, twisting the narrative into whatever suited their bias. Some hailed him as a hero, someone who had stepped in when no one else had. Others branded him a political pawn, accusing him of staging the moment for attention. He scrolled through the comments, his grip on the phone tightening. Some were supportive, praising him for standing up against hate. Others were vicious, attacking everything from his motives to his appearance, dissecting his past online presence, digging for any sign of affiliation that could be used to place him into a convenient ideological box. He set the phone down, exhaling sharply. He had expected the incident to be nothing more than a fleeting moment, a forgotten footnote in a day that had already passed. Instead, it had become something else entirely. A name, a symbol, a controversy. He ran a hand through his hair, staring at the blank wall in front of him. What had he stepped into? By the next morning, the situation had only grown. News stations had picked up the story, each twisting it into their preferred narrative. Some framed it as an inspiring moment of moral courage, a bystander stepping in to de-escalate a tense situation. Others painted it as an orchestrated event, a manufactured encounter designed to push an agenda. Daniel found his name in headlines. Who is Daniel Royce? Man from viral mall confrontation speaks out. Except he hadn't spoken out. He hadn't said anything to anyone. Yet here he was, already at the center of a storm he had never asked to be part of. His phone rang. The caller, ID displayed an unknown number, but he answered anyway. A journalist introduced himself, launching into rapid-fire questions before Daniel could even get a word in. He hung up. The phone rang again minutes later. Another reporter, then another. He stopped answering. The messages kept coming. Friends, family, co-workers, some offering support, others demanding an explanation. A few of his colleagues had sent cautious texts, asking if he was okay, if he needed anything. But there was an underlying tension in their words, an unspoken worry about how this might affect him professionally. Then there were the threats. He hadn't expected those. Scrolling further into the comment sections, he found messages filled with venom. Accusations that he had staged the entire thing, that he had been part of some elaborate setup to manipulate public perception. Some had gone further, tracking down old photos of him, piecing together fragments of his past, trying to find anything that could be used against him. His address wasn't public, but paranoia settled in his chest as he realized how easily someone could find it if they tried hard enough. He shut off his phone. The world had decided that he was a story, and whether he liked it or not, that meant they weren't going to leave him alone. Days passed, and the media frenzy refused to die down. News anchors debated his actions, panel discussions dissected his motives. He watched footage of strangers arguing over who he was, what he believed, what he had meant to do in that moment at the mall. They didn't know him. But that didn't matter. They had already decided. He received an email from a television network, requesting an exclusive interview. Another from a talk show, offering him a platform to clear the air. He ignored them all. Then, to his surprise, Anisha reached out. It was a simple message. No grand gestures, no over-explained sentiments. Just an acknowledgement. I see what they're doing to you. Let me know if you want to talk. He stared at the screen for a long time before closing the message. He didn't know if he wanted to talk, but he did know one thing. This wasn't over. Not even close. Daniel sat in the dim glow of his apartment, the curtains drawn to block out the daylight that he had once welcomed so easily. His laptop screen illuminated the darkened room, a constant stream of headlines, articles, and debates filling the space where silence used to live. The noise of the world had forced its way inside, demanding his attention, refusing to let him slip back into the anonymity he had once taken for granted. His name had become something bigger than himself. He wasn't just Daniel Royce anymore. He was the man from the mall, the subject of endless speculation, the face attached to a narrative that had spiraled beyond his control. The video had continued spreading, crossing from one platform to the next, reaching millions of eyes that had never known his existence before. The interpretations varied. Some praised him for his quick intervention, painting him as a beacon of integrity in a world starving for moral clarity. Others tore him apart, dissecting his every move, searching for ulterior motives, branding him everything from a political pawn to an opportunist capitalizing on his 15 minutes of fame. He hadn't spoken to the press. He had refused every interview request, ignored every email, let his phone ring unanswered until the calls finally slowed, but the silence hadn't stopped the world from speaking for him. One outlet had dug into his past, finding old social media posts, attempting to craft a narrative of who he was based on fragmented opinions from years ago. Another had interviewed people who barely knew him, asking what kind of person he had been before the incident. The responses varied, each one warped to fit the angle the publication wanted to push. Some of his co-workers had distanced themselves. A few had sent supportive messages in private, but in professional circles he could feel the hesitation, the careful way conversations shifted when he entered the room. He had become a topic too controversial to discuss openly, a name that carried risk. And yet, despite everything, despite the overwhelming exhaustion of existing under a microscope, the one thing that lingered most was Anisha's message. She had reached out days ago, offering him the chance to talk. He had stared at the screen for hours, debating whether to respond, whether to let himself be pulled deeper into something he had never asked to be part of. He had told himself he wouldn't reply. But now, as the weight of everything pressed against his chest, as the isolation of his own silence began to suffocate him, he opened the message again. And then, against every instinct, he responded. The meeting was arranged quietly, away from prying eyes and cameras. Anisha had chosen the location, a discreet cafe tucked into a quiet corner of the city, far from the chaos that followed them both. When Daniel arrived, she was already seated in the farthest booth, a cup of untouched coffee in front of her. She didn't stand when he approached. She simply watched him, assessing, waiting. He slid into the seat across from her, exhaling slowly as he placed his phone face down on the table. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She was the first to break the silence. She acknowledged the storm that had swallowed him whole, the way the world had twisted a simple act into a spectacle. She had seen it happen before, had lived it more times than she cared to count. She told him that this would not go away on its own, that silence would not protect him, that once a person became part of the machine, the only way out was through. Daniel listened. He had spent his entire life avoiding the spotlight, staying out of the crossfire of public opinion. He had never cared for politics, had never wanted to be involved in ideological wars. He had stepped in that day because it had felt like the right thing to do. That was all. But the world didn't see simplicity. The world saw narratives, saw agendas waiting to be pushed, saw opportunities to take a moment and twist it into something bigger, something louder. Anisha studied him, her gaze sharp but not unkind. She told him that he had a choice now. He could disappear, let the world decide his story for him, or he could take control of it, speak for himself before someone else did. Daniel didn't respond right away. He wasn't sure he wanted to be part of this fight. But the reality was, whether he wanted it or not, he already was. The news cycle had not let go of his name. New articles emerged every day, some defending him, others condemning him. Theories spread like wildfire, each one more exaggerated than the last. A political commentator accused him of being planted in the mall as part of a staged event. An opposing voice claimed he had been unfairly vilified, that he was proof that ordinary citizens were no longer safe from the court of public opinion. Everywhere he looked, people had an opinion about him. Strangers debated his character as if they had known him for years. A well-known podcast spent an entire episode dissecting the moment he had stepped between Anisha and the woman, analyzing his body language, questioning his motivations, debating whether he had acted out of genuine instinct or an attempt to gain attention. They argued over whether his silence in the aftermath was proof of guilt or wisdom. Daniel had never felt more like a stranger to himself. The calls from reporters had started up again, the invitations to appear on talk shows becoming more aggressive. He was no longer just an anonymous man in a viral video. He was a symbol now, whether he wanted to be or not. His family had reached out too. His mother had called, her voice tight with worry, asking if he was okay. His father, a man of few words, had simply told him to be careful. Even his younger brother, who rarely paid attention to the news, had sent him a message telling him to lay low, but Daniel knew there was no such thing as laying low anymore. A week later, he made his decision. He sat in his apartment, staring at the blinking cursor on his laptop screen. The words came slowly at first, then all at once. He wrote a statement, not for the press, not for interviews, but for himself. He addressed the moment at the mall, the reasons he had intervened, the way the world had taken that moment and shaped it into something unrecognizable. He rejected the attempts to turn him into a political pawn, refused to let strangers define his character based on one act. He sent the statement to one outlet, and then he turned off his computer. It was not a grand gesture. It was not a media tour, not an attempt to extend the spotlight that had been forced upon him. It was simply his words, in his voice. The world would do with them what it wanted. But for the first time since that day, he felt like he had reclaimed something. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough. But even as he tried to move on, the world had other plans. The statement went live the next morning, and within hours it had been dissected, analyzed, and spun into a dozen different interpretations. Some praised him for finally speaking, calling his words thoughtful, measured. Others saw it as calculated, an attempt to control the narrative rather than let the truth speak for itself. News stations debated his decision to remain mostly silent, questioning whether his avoidance of interviews was a sign of guilt or wisdom. People who had never met him, never spoken to him, continued to argue over what kind of man he was, what his true intentions had been. Daniel watched from the sidelines, knowing now that he had never really had control. He had told himself that releasing the statement would bring closure. Instead, it had only extended the conversation. And as he sat in the quiet of his apartment, watching his name continue to spread, he realized that he was never going to be the same again. ChatGPT can make mistakes. Check important info.